Hi, and welcome to Parent Switch Training. I'm Cheska, one of the OTs. Our training didn't record properly earlier, so I'm just going to do a quick whistle-stop tour of what we talked about. So if I can get up the presentation for you all to see. So yeah, we're going to be talking about switching. So what is a switch and why use it? So simply put, a switch is a button or simple device that allows an individual to activate something. So like you can see in the picture, the child is pressing the button and the minion is activating. So we use switches to increase participation and independence in activities like play. Works on many skills, including but not limited to cause and effect. So knowing if I do something, something else happens. For those that use their upper limbs to access the switches, might work on upper limb use, works generally on purposeful movement, whatever part of your body you're using to activate that switch. There'll be lots of communication opportunities. It works on attention, to attending to the effect that you've caused. And depending on how you use the switch, you might be working on higher level skills. So for example, if you're using it for power mobility, you'd have to demonstrate possibly spatial awareness of the room. If you're using it for ICT, kind of how to understand how to play the games, and just generally because it's fun. So one of the key messages that we wanted to get across is that although switching is a great activity to work on all those skills, we're really looking at it as an access method for participation. So what that means is we want to reduce the physical aspect of the task to allow children to focus on the activity itself. So we don't want them to be working so hard to use their hands or head that they can't then enjoy the activity that they're participating in. So we want them to be able to show us, demonstrate if they like an activity, if they don't like it, to be able to be kind of independent in that activity as much as possible and just make that as accessible as possible for them. So switching is kind of our access method for activities. It is not the activity itself. So switching can seem like a really simple task, but actually there's so many steps that go into it. And we're often seeing children, expected to complete these tasks so quickly, and we want to jump in and help them if they're not attending to things, if they're not moving quick enough. But actually it's a really complex task and we need to just step back, give them processing time, give them space to have a go. So they have to be aware that a switch is there and attend to it. So they have to be aware that it's not just a table in front of me, it's not just my tray in front of me, there's something else there. They've got to process that is a switch, I'm going to press it. They've then got to initiate a motor movement to think, okay, I'm going to try and press that switch. They then need to complete motor planning. So how am I going to move my body to activate that switch? They've then got to register that an effect has happened and process what that effect is. They've got to attend to it, so they've got to look at it, they've got to be aware of it, they've got to give all their attention to it. They then might want to communicate a response. So I like that, I didn't like that, I was interested, I wasn't interested. And then we're asking them to repeat that maybe again and again and again. So there's an awful lot of steps that go into that. So types of switches, so we had some out earlier, but the pictures here. So there's lots and lots of different types of switches, but some common ones that we use in school are Big Macs. So they're your simple voice output ones that you might press it, might say more, finish, stop. A Little Mac is the same, but a bit smaller. And your power pads at the top of the screen there, they're flush with the table. So they're quite good for children who can't necessarily move their hands to get onto something. But the thing is you have to, because they're flush with the table and they don't click, they wouldn't necessarily be good for someone with, say, a visual impairment who would have to know through a clicking sound that they've activated that switch. The other sort of all the red switches down here, all very similar, just a button, but they all need different activation forces to when you press them to activate something. So a smoothie, for example, needs quite a low activation force, and you can hit it on any area of the switch and it will activate. Some switches you need more of a central press to be able to do that, so you need to be a bit more targeted in your press. Some of the specialist switches that you might see in school. So a candy corn is a proximity switch. So that means you don't have to press it, you just have to move your body towards it in a certain proximity and it will go off. It will activate the effect. It's quite good for children who might be very effortful to make certain movements, but it might not be so good for children who have lots of uncontrolled movements, as they might accidentally press it when they don't mean to. Vibe light switch is one that vibrates and lights up, or it can do one or neither or the other, and that might be quite good for children who have might not kind of sort of be aware that a switch is there. It might draw their attention to it, or children with a visual impairment, for example. One thing to note about those switches is it can be quite distracting because they vibrate and light up, so it might take away from participating in the activity itself. Wireless switches for children who might get distracted by kind of tangled in the wires, and then you've got micro light switches that just need the tiniest activation force to press them. Switch mounts, so some children it doesn't work for their switch just to be on their tray in front of them, and they need an additional mount. So goose mounts and flexi mounts are kind of wibbly wobbly, so you can move them in all directions. They're often used for head switching, so if you push them here, you can turn your head. The boy in the picture is using it for his hand. The thing is, if you have children who have quite high tone or quite powerful movements, they can often be knocked out of the way. Universal mounts you can lock in place, so they're a bit more secure, but personally I found that they can break quite easily. The splats mounts are like Dyson for your switch, so they don't slip around. And the Maxus mounts, the little triangles at the bottom, are quite good for angling the switch. So might be for children who kind of use more sideways movements to hit the switch, or maybe if they're side lying and switching, they can kind of move their arm and use kind of larger movements to hit it. And you can get Maxus mounts in all different sizes. Some switch accessories, so the ones I really like personally, my favorite little star next to it is the PowerLink box. So this basically you can plug in, and you can plug in things with an on-off switch, and you can make them switch adapted. So that might be a food blender, and that might be a lamp, that might be all sorts of stuff around the house or at school, and it's a really good way to make lots of activities switch accessible. A crick box is how you connect to a computer, so it's a USB. And the softy tops are little foam tops that you put on top of switches that make them softer, and they also reduce that clicking sound. So some children like to repetitively bang the switch because they like that clicking sound and the noise it makes, and that just sort of dampens that effect. So activities, so these are taken from some posters I put around school just to get staff really thinking about different ways we can use switches. And there are endless ways you can use switches, and it'd be great to know how people are using them at home. So we can do that kind of thing here too. So one is, the PowerLink box, an example is setting up a hair drying station after swimming. So children can kind of be involved in self-care. Odd jobs, I think that's a particularly great one for maybe some of the key stage 2, some of the older children. So they could do things like shredding paper, using handheld hoover, all the kind of odd jobs around the house or at school. Cooking is a great one. There's so much you can do. So blending food, making smoothies, popcorn makers, toasting sandwiches. There's lots of great artwork you can do with switches. So you'll see in the picture, they've stuck crayons to the top of a canvas, then using a hairdryer to melt them and making wax patterns. You can also do stuff like using crayons. You can dip ping pong balls in paint and kind of blow them across canvas with a fan or a hairdryer. There's lots of communication opportunities, so you can use a voice output switch to tell jokes, make requests, comment, say something. Power mobility is one that lots of you might know, so Bugsies or the Smile platform, and that's an opportunity to use multiple switches or using switches for going different directions. Lots of switch toys, and Merry actually switch adapt toys for free at Christmas. So if you could get high street toys and then send them to be switch adapted. And ICT, there's loads you can do with ICT. You can you can turn the page in a storybook, you can play games, you can listen to music. So it's really just to get across that switching is so much more than just a switch toy. So now we'll talk a little bit about assessment, which It's quite detailed, but it's just to get an idea about the types of questions that therapists might ask themselves when they're doing a switch assessment, and how we might come to give different children different types of switches. So it's not to necessarily remember the ins and outs, but just so you have an idea of the kind of process that we use during switch assessment. So the kind of things we ask ourselves are, what is a child's most purposeful or reliable movement? So do they prefer using their heads, their hands, their fingers, and what range can they achieve? So a child might be better off using their head, but they might actually only really be able to move their head to the left and struggle to the right. So therefore we might be thinking about putting the switch on the left-hand side. What's the easiest way to facilitate this movement? So we want to be reducing the physical demand as much as possible so that we can focus on the cognitive aspect and them actually engaging in the task. So we might think about positioning and specialist equipment to support that as well. So for lots of children, that will be in wheelchairs or class chairs. Some children might do this in side lying or standing frames in different positions, but that's kind of one of the questions we have. What's the target skill? So what we're working on, where are they at? So we use a document called the Switch Progression Roadmap, which we'll talk about in a bit, to kind of guide that. So are they working on just kind of attending to an effect, or are they working on physically pressing the switch? What level of prompting do they need? So do they need physical sort of hand over hand support? Do they just need a verbal reminder to press the switch? Do they need no prompts? What are appropriate activities for them? What do they enjoy? What kind of things can you be using the switch for? What's their preferred communication method? So are we using Makaton, symbols, touch cues to support their learning of that? And do they have any sensory impairments that might have an impact? So do they have any vision or hearing impairments or any tactile sensitivity? So an example, this isn't a child who goes to school. This is just kind of an example to have a think about what that might look like in real life. So say we have an 11-year-old child with cerebral palsy. In the sensory pathway, they find turning their head the easiest. They're a non-verbal communicator, and they might possibly have some reduced vision. So they're able to turn their head full range in the wheelchair, so they can turn it left and right equally. And we'd be thinking that if you're doing switching with your head switch, more often than not, the activity is going to be in front of you. So we don't want to be encouraging people to have to do really large turns left or right with their head when they then have to bring their head back to the center to engage. Their target skill was to be able to consistently press a switch to make something happen, to engage in an activity independently. They just needed some initial physical prompting to tell them that their switch was being put by their head, and then just verbal afterwards. They liked power mobility and communicating messages to adults. Their preferred communication method was large symbols, simple verbal communication, touch cues. They might have had reduced vision, but no other sensory needs. So they can turn left or right. So we thought, okay, so we can use a mount to mount that switch either side of their head. Because it's on their head, they're likely to need a smaller switch, because you don't want to be pressing a switch with your entire face. Because that child had quite strong tone, we'd want to look at quite strong mounting solutions. Some of the flexy wibbly wobbly mounts might not have been the best. They were sat in their wheelchair. We looked at, could we use their wheelchair headrest to put the switches on, or do we need something extra? Would having a softy top, the foam bit, make their switching more comfortable? We wanted a brightly coloured switch at the start of the activity to show them, to support any visual needs. And because they couldn't see the switch whilst they're head switching, we actually thought, no, we do want a switch that makes a click so that we know that they've pressed it. So we didn't use a softy top. They wanted a voice output to communicate simple messages. So we'd use a switch like a Big Mac, which you can record that. And then you need a smaller switch to be able to drive things like the platform. So we used a small jelly bean switch, which is in the picture there. So that's kind of how we would go along an assessment. Here at the school, at the end, we get switch programs. So we're trying to get around the children now in switch clinic to make sure they're assessed and they have a program. So the one on the left is typically what our programs look like. The one on the right has a little bit more information about what switching is, which we gave out during school closures to some children. So the switching program will have the aims. It will look at the switch progression steps. So you can see they'll have a bit about what they can do, what they're currently working on, and the next steps. So that will sort of be the longer term targets. Then it will have switch type, how you set it up, what kind of prompting they need, activity ideas, and communication. So it's important just to say the activity ideas are not exhaustive by any means. So there's lots more that children can do. It's just a couple of ideas to get things going. So the switch progression roadmap, which we talked about earlier, so that's a free document from Inclusive Technology. So you can go on the Inclusive Technology website and download that. And that's generally where we kind of look at next steps. They've got a switch progression roadmap. So they kind of break switching down into experimental learning. So that's just kind of looking at the switch, being around the switch, maybe listening to an auditory effect that it's caused, just kind of being aware it's there, responding to the switch and its effect. Then you kind of make something happen. So that's the child that actually actively pressing the switch and holding it, pressing it, taking their hand off, going back to press it again. Then you kind of get down to your two switches. So you might have one switch that does something, one switch that does something else, or you might have one switch that starts an activity, one switch that stops. And it looks at it as kind of a developing skill. So you might start with experimental learning, then move to make something happen, then move to two switches. It's important to say, so not all children are going to move through all of those areas. And there's lots of sort of, that's a vertical learning, but there's lots of horizontal learning. So there's 3 areas within make something happen, and it's not to say that one is a higher skill than the other. They're kind of all happening together. So there's lots of horizontal learning. So children might progress horizontally as well as vertically. So just an example of a home embedding switch example, just to give an idea, even with just a simple switch press, how much children can engage and achieve and participate. And that's kind of what our overall aim is. So it's not, we're not aiming for children to have loads and loads of switches and kind of be overloaded. We're just trying to get our message across that there's so much that you can do. We can reduce that physical demand, but we can actually increase that participation so much. So in the morning, you might join in breakfast smoothies for the family using switch activated blender. You then might be able to join in with ICT games on the computer using a quick box and a switch. So you might be able to tell stories, play a game, listen to music. In the afternoon, you could do some powered mobility. So you might drive to the park on a whizzy bug, go around the house in a Bugsy. Then you could do some art activity with a sibling with your switches. And in the evening, you could control the family playlist for dinner. So there's so much that we can do with switching. Just some troubleshooting. So we're just going to go through some common questions or problems that people often come to us with. So he likes the button bash. So that's when we'd say maybe try he likes the button bash. So that's when children are kind of getting distracted by the clicking of the switch and focusing on that rather than the activity themselves. So that's why we might say try a softy top, try a pal pad switch, that's flush with the table that doesn't have that clicking noises. So that might be looking at the type of switch that a child is using to kind of tweak that. And press the switch, hit the button. So what we're trying to encourage is not to use language about the switch. So the switch is the means to complete the activity. So we want to be using activity focused language. So turn on the lights, turn on the hairdryer, and making sure it's activity focused. He doesn't like switching anymore. So again, that's thinking about the activity. So switching isn't an activity. We need to change up the activity if someone's not liking that. So if someone has used the same switch toy for ages and ages, then they probably are going to find that a bit boring. So it's looking at what activities we're offering with switching. She understands cause and effect. She always presses the switch when I give it to her. So we're trying to make sure that there's a really clear distinction between if you present something to somebody, then they might respond just because that's a new stimuli that's suddenly new in their environment, and they might reach towards it and interact with that. And that's different to having a switch in place throughout an activity and a child kind of being aware of that, pressing it, exploring it to cause and effect. And we're just making sure that there's a clear understanding of the difference between that. So or the best way to do that is to make sure the switch is in place, in the same place for the duration of the activity, so that a child can get used to it being there and explore it. I always have to help her. So again, that's just reminding, we go back to how complex actually a switching task is. It's a task that requires physical and cognitive skills and using it all together. And some children may always need help, but it's remembering that there's lots of things that they might be doing independently as well. So they might be attending to the switch independently, and attending to the effect, but they might need a little bit of help with the motor bit, or vice versa. So it's just kind of looking at those small steps and actually where we're offering support and where they're engaging in that themselves. She already knows how to press a switch. It's just too easy. Again, we're highlighting that pressing the switch isn't the end goal. The main goal is participation. So we're saying, yes, you can press a switch, but how much have you embedded that into your daily life, and how much is the child accessing through switching? And that's what we really want to get across. So how can we utilize that switch press to really open up and make things accessible for children? And that is the end. That's where we got to the questions. So please let OT or speech know if you have any questions, or you'd like any support at home, or you'd like to know a little bit more about what your child is doing with switching at school, or speak to your class teachers. Thank you very much.